sometimes a seed that is sown during a student's time at school grows into something really, really impressive and really, really unexpected when they leave school. And they go on to do incredible things from one small little idea or one small little interest that began in school. And that is certainly the case for today's guest. My name is Simon Henderson. I am Head of History and Sixth Form at Teasdale School, and this is episode 12 of Made in Teasdale.
Made in Teasdale.
And we actually sat there one night watching John Wayne's stagecoach film projected onto the wall while looking down at the scene below.
It is absolutely fascinating seeing inner city London children dropped into the middle of a working farm.
I have very fond memories of growing up in Teasdale. I mean, living in the countryside and having, loads of fresh air, loads of space to play.
It really is the case that if you come from County Durham, and in my case have lived in southwest London for 40 years, County Durham's still what I call home.
Made in Teasdale.
My guest for this episode is Jake Madgwick Lawton, who was always a keen football fan, a loyal supporter of Arsenal, and was also a studious history student. He did a lot of work during his time in the sixth form with the Holocaust Educational Trust after he was chosen to represent the school as one of our Year 12 students on the Lessons from Auschwitz project. Jake has taken those interests and those things that he is passionate about and run with them in some really, really interesting and impressive directions. Hi Jake, how are you?
I'm good, thanks, Hendo. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. Thank you for agreeing to feature on the Made in Teasdale podcast. I wonder if you could start by telling our listeners when you were at Teasdale School and some memories of your formative years.
So I would have started Teasdale in 2008 and left in 2015, so the Obama years, I suppose. And I grew up in Gainford, quite a big village, really, in Teasdale terms. And I have really fond memories looking back on that time of whether it's climbing trees down the river or playing out on the village green. It's a lovely little community, really, in terms of sports days and bonfire nights. And it's great to look back on the sort of tight community. And I feel really lucky to have grown up in a village like Gainford. I think it's interesting that I'd never really felt like a local within Teasdale or Gainford. I think my family had moved up from South London to Teasdale when I was 1, so I always felt like a bit of an outsider. And actually that changed really when I left school, moved down to London and took part in a programme with school leavers from all across London, about 100. And I was the only one who wasn't from London, and many of them had never been north of Watford, so to them I was this northern curiosity. And it was at that moment that really I sort of became, in my own sort of mind, like a northerner from Teasdale. So that completely changed my idea of who I was and where I was from.
Yeah, it's interesting, that, isn't it? So you were included as a northerner once you were back in the south. Yeah, it's interesting. So talk to us about the A levels that you did and what you went on to study after that.
So I studied history, politics, and English, which are all great, all really nice teachers for all subjects. Politics was a really interesting one because the second year of A levels, I was the only person in the class with Mr. Maguire, so that was quite interesting dynamic. But we'd have some good debates and good conversations, and I mean, and I can't think of many other schools where you'd be the only person in the class. So I felt quite lucky having that contact. And it allowed me to sort of pursue things within school. Like with Mr. Maguire, I suggested hosting a debate during the 2015 general election and invited all the different candidates and the political parties in, and was able to sort of host that and debate that and allow students to
broadcast on Radio Teasdale, wasn't it?
It was, yeah. I mean, it's funny looking back on it now, because I remember one of the questions a student asked was, "What's the point in voting in this area? Labour always win." So I think it shows that was only 5-6 years ago how quickly things change.
What's interesting is part of I guess it's part of the legacy of that initiative that you started. We had in conjunction with Radio Tees, we had a live debate hosted in the common room with the candidates, and it was recorded and it went out on BBC Radio Tees later on that evening during the last election. So yes, and we all know the result of that did contradict what that student said about they always vote Labour. So I know that you took some time out before you went to university. Tell us about what you did in your gap year.
Yeah, so immediately after leaving school, I was actually invited to go to Jerusalem on a study visit with the Holocaust Educational Trust, who I'd done work with within school, taking part in the Lessons from Auschwitz project and doing projects within school. And so then I was invited to go to Jerusalem and Tel Aviv and study the Holocaust in greater depth that summer, which was a really interesting trip. Learned so much both about the Holocaust as well as other aspects of history and the sort of history that I was interested in. And particularly, it inspired me to do work with the Holocaust Educational Trust and football. It was surprising when I was there how often football came up, although we were there to study the Holocaust, whether it was looking at stories of survivors and their support of football, or their playing of football within camps or ghettos, or even just sort of talking to like Palestinian market traders, or the British ambassador in Tel Aviv. Met him and he was an Arsenal fan, so we had a good chat. And then back from then, so I got a job in London, working at the Marriott Hotel in Canary Wharf and studying like business administration on the side of that. So the work itself was sort of interesting work. The best part of it really was when football teams would sometimes stay at the hotel. So that was always fun. In fact, Newcastle stayed a couple of times, and I remember helping De Jong try and get his Amazon Fire Stick to work in his room. One of the things you learned was speaking to lots of footballers who needed help, not necessarily the brightest people. But anyway, so then being in London, it allowed me to do a lot more work with the trust. And just after getting back from Jerusalem, I was at an event and I was chatting with 3 Holocaust survivors, Harry Spyro, Harry Bibring and Ziggy Schipper. And they're 2 Arsenal fans, 1 Spurs fan. And I remember we were at this event that was all about Holocaust education, a really serious, difficult topic. And we just, the 4 of us, were chatting about whether Arsene Wenger should stay on as Arsenal boss. And it struck me really as amazing that we were different generations, we were born in different countries, completely different life experiences, but we're just chatting about the same stuff. And also as an Arsenal fan personally, it struck me that within my club, there's a lot of anti-Semitic chants and abuse, and especially for Harry Spyro and Ziggy Schipper, who are Arsenal fans, been to Arsenal games over the years, that's not really an acceptable thing. So I got in touch with Arsenal as well, and it was helpful that I was in London, so I actually organised a meeting with the head of the charity branch of the club and discussed different ways in which the club would go about combating that, which then led to me writing an article for the Arsenal programme for Holocaust Memorial Day, which was in 2016, I guess. And then also having some survivors come in to speak to some of the youth players as well. And since then, the Holocaust Educational Trust have set up similar programmes with other London clubs and across Britain. So it was great really to be in London, both working but also pursuing that work with the Trust. And then it meant that for the 2016 Holocaust Memorial Day, I was invited to speak at the House of Commons, and met and had a good chat with Nicky Morgan, who was then Education Secretary, which shows how long ago that was. And then also the Foreign Office as well, some people, sort of diplomats from other countries. And it really just showed me how important football is as a means of bringing people together. And although we have these dark and difficult histories, actually approaching it from these different topics is often a lot easier. And then that's something that then carried on during my time at university, but took kind of a different turn, which we'll come on to.
Yeah, I mean, it strikes me, people who maybe don't know as much about the sort of rivalry between Arsenal and Spurs as you do. I know that one of there's quite a big Jewish contingent of Spurs supporters, isn't there? And actually, one of the Spurs chants is Yid Army. To what extent do you think that anti-Semitism amongst Arsenal fans was a product of that rivalry with Tottenham?
I mean, yeah, it's entirely a product of that, and it's Chelsea and Spurs, because of their rivalry, have similar problems. And I think Spurs, yeah, historically had a strong Jewish community, but now the Jewish community makes a very small minority of total Spurs fans, and there's a broader debate about whether Spurs fans should carry on using that language. And I know David Baddiel's done a lot of work campaigning around that issue, and at the very least trying to educate people, so at the very least they know. I think what struck me going to Arsenal games is that you'd hear some degree of anti-Semitic language used at almost every game, including from people younger than me who didn't really understand what they were saying or what the context of that was. And so I thought it was really just important that to get survivors to speak to players and fans, just so that they at least know, and then at least they can make an informed decision, and hopefully over time language will change, and language within football changes all the time, and there's lots of problems with abuse about lots of different groups. But I think specifically with Arsenal, I think the anti-Semitic abuse is something that I witnessed and I didn't really think was kind of acceptable. And actually, when I moved up to Scotland for university, I remember the second football game I was at, I heard anti-Semitic abuse there as well. So I think it showed, including at one of their own players. So I think it shows how widespread the problem is. That it's not limited to one club or even one country, but we've all got to try and do something to try and mitigate the problems.
I think what's really pleasing to hear is something that you started as a year 12 student, going on a Lessons from Auschwitz project that you did in the sixth form, and then you took that on with the Holocaust Educational Trust to do the work around. You did a sort of a minute silence, a walk around the school, which I remember when that actually coincidentally happened during an Ofsted inspection, and I know the Ofsted inspectors were incredibly impressed with what they saw and what you'd organised, and then to be able to go on as you have and have such an influence in speaking in Parliament or in the sporting arena. The work you've done with Arsenal is incredible. That seed that was sown has grown, and you've been able to develop that so far. Thinking about a broader question, we've had a lot of publicity about Black Lives Matter campaign as a result of the George Floyd murder last year, and I think the resonance of that in the way that he was killed at a time where people all across the world are dying of a respiratory illness, and he's having the life choked out of him by a police officer. That obviously shone the light on racism in society in a way that maybe it hasn't been shone so brightly as it has in the last sort of 12 months. What do you think about the issue of racism and football in general? Do you think that football has a special problem with racism, or do you think that is a product of the society in which the football is being played?
I mean, I think it's both, really. There's a certain mob mentality of football that allows people to say things that they wouldn't say to people on the street and be especially abusive. And I think then social media is just another platform that encourages and allows that to happen. But I think we see that when you look back on the history of early football, there's cases of black players with very little documented abuse of them in terms of racist abuse. We don't know if that's because it wasn't recorded very well, or simply because people's exposure to racism was so limited then they just didn't have those kind of racist beliefs which are so prevalent today. I mean, if you think of Arthur Wharton, who was the first British professional black player, he started his career off in Darlington, and there's been a lot of coverage very recently about his role and kind of what he stood for and what he meant. So I think it's important to look back on the histories of these players and make sure that it's clear that black British people have been part of football since the very beginning, and that we need to make sure that black players are protected and that race is not out within football. But I think part of that is learning about the long histories of both black participation in sports, but also racism within sports.
Yeah, I agree. So you talked about the fact that you went on to Scotland to to your university study. Where did you go and what did you study?
Yeah, so I went to Edinburgh to study history and politics, and then later dropped the politics part of that. It was particularly because at the end of my first year of university, I was back home for the summer, and then I'd been out campaigning all across the constituency during the election then. And it was really interesting to, not just in Teasdale, but in Childon and Spennymoor and Bishop Auckland, speaking to lots of different voters and sort of understanding some of the problems that people were dealing with. And then spent the rest of the summer working, had an internship with a bank in their corporate social responsibility team, going around the country, meeting with social entrepreneurs and seeing some of the charity work. I think really that summer it sort of turned me off from politics. I think seeing both the inequalities and then sort of corporate wealth and charity, I think it made me realise that history was more of an opportunity to study things that really brought people together and were a bit more uniting. And then, especially then, I was given an opportunity to study a course, brand new course at Edinburgh on the history of football. And a lot of that was looking at the history within the city itself. Edinburgh was home to the world's first football club in 1824, although not really football as we would know it today. And also the home of the world's oldest professional football derby, and has a really rich women's football history as well, going back to the 1880s and 90s. So it was interesting to study about that, but also global football as well, and how football spread around the world. So it was studying football then. And then from that point onwards, I studied for any point that I could, had a choice of what period or aspect of history. It was always football, really. So that, at least half of my honours courses I made focused on football in some way.
So before we go back to the history of football and your study of that, just pick up something interesting that you said. You said that during your work on the election, you became a bit disillusioned with studying politics. It was something that you thought divided a lot of people. And you also mentioned earlier the comment that was made during that debate that you hosted back in 2015 about what's the point in voting because Labour always wins here anyway. Does your disillusionment with politics continue? Are you sort of less engaged than you were? Have you become cynical, or do you just feel as though it's not something that you want to pursue academically?
Well, I think it's hard to not become a bit cynical. I mean, I'm still engaged. I mean, the 2019 election, I still came back home early to be out canvassing and campaigning during that campaign, and was at the count that evening when obviously a different MP was elected. So I think I'm still engaged, but I think it felt difficult really to be studying it in an academic way when I think it felt like so many things were changing, and felt a little bit hopeless and felt just detached from people's lives, I suppose, that as much as kind of the academic study of politics is important and interesting, I think it just feels increasingly distant from the people's lives, included within our own community. Whereas I think that's what appeals to me about studying history, and particularly history of football, something that people are so interested in. And that, I mean, football is one of the few things in society that we all simultaneously, or most of us anyway, simultaneously participate in. And I think there's an enormous power in that, in what that can achieve. I mean, I think Marcus Rashford showed that really, that his unique role as a footballer has brought sort of change around in a way that I don't think would have been possible of somebody in other spheres of society.
And, you know, speaking as someone who is a historian of mainly of sport and the civil rights movement, some of my work in the past, I sometimes always got the niggling feel that sort of studying sports history or studying the history of football was somehow not seen as 100% as academically credible as studying something else. Have you come across any of that sort of academic snobbery?
Well, I think I had that snobbery. I never realised that there could be serious academic study of sport and football until it came up as a course at uni, really. And that was a brand new course that just happened to kind of be introduced while I was in the right year for it. So I think I didn't realise that there was such a wealth of literature all about kind of the sociology of sport and the elder history of sport from its inception, and the debates about the origins of football. And it really opened up a whole new world for me to explore, whether that's looking at women's football or, being up in Scotland particularly, I looked a lot at identity in football and sectarianism and the sorts of divides there, as well as the now transnational histories of football and global football, which is something I'm researching now. But there's so many avenues through which football can be a lens to look at. And I think it just makes it a lot easier to discuss with people and engage with people. I think particularly studying a topic of a sort of dark and difficult history like the Holocaust, I always found it was quite hard to engage with people about it. I mean, a couple of years ago, I took part in a kilt walk, which is like a charity fundraising thing in Scotland, where you walk 23 miles from Glasgow to Loch Lomond. And I did it with a group of people raising money for the Holocaust Educational Trust. And at the end of the walk, there's someone there with a microphone who goes up to groups and asks, "Oh, where are you from?" And the crowd were all cheering. And they came up to us and said, "Where are you from?" We said, "The Holocaust Educational Trust." And a sort of awkward silence falls upon the crowd because they're not really sure how to respond to that, which is understandable. It's a difficult topic. But I think when you talk about something like football, it just opens that conversation. Everybody has a story. Even if you don't like football, you still probably have some kind of personal story that involves football in some way.
Yeah, I agree. I've always said that sport in general, football more specifically, does play such a huge role in society that obviously a study of that and the history of it does help us to see some things about society, and does help us to see some things about the past that's just as valid as maybe studying more conventional political history. So you are currently, I believe, studying for a master's, is that correct? What is all that about?
Yeah, so we're coming towards the end of university. So the final summer before I graduated, I had another internship within finance, working within a team who handled business mortgages. And it made me realise that is not what I wanted to pursue. It did not match up with my interests at all, really. So I had decided that I'd like to carry on further study of history, but that I couldn't afford to do a master's, basically. So I thought that I would graduate, just get a job, save up some money, and then later down the line do a master's. That then became difficult because I graduated in July of 2020, when it was slightly difficult to just get a job. But I remember the week I just finished my dissertation, which was also about the history of football and history of football in prisoner of war camps in the First World War. I just submitted that and then thought, well, what am I going to do with the next step of my life? And had incredibly optimistically just Googled football history jobs, and up popped an opportunity with Everton Football Club, where they were looking for somebody to study an understudied or overlooked aspect of the club's history, and also write a chapter on the club's history for a book that they're currently writing and publishing about the club's response to the COVID situation. So I sent off a proposal to the club, and a couple of months later, luckily, heard back and was chosen for that position. And so what I had proposed studying was Everton's overseas tours. They were the first British professional club to go on an overseas tour in 1905, went to Austria-Hungary, and then they went to South America and Nazi Germany and all around the world, basically. And so I proposed looking at all their pre-World War II tours. Since then, the club have actually said they're interested in me looking at all of their overseas tours for over a century. So it's slightly broadened the scope and my ability to go into detail about the tours. But that's currently what I'm researching. And actually, I think I was partly inspired to do that because of coming from Teesdale and East County Durham, really. I think being aware of, and I'm sure you know about the story of West Auckland winning World Cup in 1909 and 1911, beating Juventus and champions from Germany and Switzerland. So I think having some awareness of those early footballing histories of these guys who just travelled the world, who would have never left Britain, but football was their key to do that. And particularly in my mind was, I don't know if it's the story of Jack Greenwell, who, if people are listening don't know, it just has such an amazing story. So he was part of that West Auckland team. And then after going to Europe and playing against Juventus and winning the World Cup, as it's sort of referred to. He ended up going to Barcelona, where he played as a player, then coached FC Barcelona on 2 separate occasions. So it's argued that he's actually the longest serving history of Barcelona ever. And then coached like Espanyol, Valencia, won loads of Spanish Cups. The outbreak of the Spanish Civil War interrupted his coaching there. So he came back to Britain, couldn't get any job. No one wanted to have anything to do with this guy. He was from Crook, but they didn't want anything to do with him because what he'd done in Spain, they didn't really value. Then went to South America, coached Peru, won the South American Cup with Peru. Is the only non-South American coach to ever win the South American Cup. So I think being from where we are and knowing about these histories of these amazing figures and how they went off and shared football with the world and engaged with different peoples, I think that was probably what inspired me to look at this early transnational history. And then speaking to Everton as well, they were really keen to explore these issues further and find out really what Everton had given to the footballing world. But these are just teams of working class blokes in Merseyside and across Britain, travelling across oceans and across continents. But what did they bring back as well when they returned? And there's such amazing stories that I've come across already about how some of the players sort of engaged with locals, as well as the directors of Everton as well, referred to some of the tours as being the purpose of sort of challenging prejudice as far back as 1909. So I think we can really learn a lot today from what these people tried to do.
Absolutely. What's your timeline for what's the sort of end date for this project for Everton? And have you got scope to explore more projects with them, do you think?
Yeah, so it should be finishing up about October. And I think from conversations that I've had with them so far, there's definitely some scope for further study and further research within the club. I mean, they're currently in the process of moving stadiums, so they've got a lot of projects about kind of renewing the heritage of Goodison Park and carrying with that to the new ground, as well as doing lots of work about the history of the club and using that to service the local community who are suffering from dementia as well. So I think it's a really interesting time to working with a football club who are doing a lot. I mean, their community branch, kind of national leading really in terms of a lot of their work they do with the community, and it's great that they're so interested in involving history in that way.
Yeah, I think, and also with Liverpool being such an important international port for much of the 19th and 20th century, that transnational history is probably likely to be particularly rich for a club like Everton. So you've talked about London, you've talked about Teesdale, you've talked about Edinburgh. Where are you? And then you're working with Everton. Where do I find you in the world at this point?
I'm back in Teasdale in Gainford at the moment, actually.
There you go.
Because I mean, I'm hoping to get to Liverpool soon, but with the archives being closed, there's not much point in being there, really. But I'm hoping that soon the Liverpool Records office will be able to reopen and that I can get in there and dig through some old programmes and ticket stubs and all the sort of memorabilia that they've got that I can sift through and learn more about. But yeah, hopefully I'll be there soon. But at the moment, I've been back in Teesdale and it's been nice to be here.
Yeah, and as a fellow history anorak, there is something incredibly exciting and special about being in an archive and sort of touching things that people wrote on or produced hundreds of years before, or sort of documents that you maybe think that other people might not have seen the light of day, and you're using it in a different way. That is an incredibly exciting thing to do if you're really into history. So a lot of your work really, when you're not in archives, and is probably on your own with a laptop, doing some research, studying. And a lot of people at the moment find themselves remote learning, working from home, having to work very independently. What advice would you have for students who find themselves in that position and maybe are struggling a bit with motivation or how to keep themselves going during this period?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're all feeling pretty isolated at the moment, and it's difficult for everyone, missing friends, family, and their community. So I guess I'd say try and share what you're doing as much as possible, whether that's with sort of other students who are in your class or sort of friends and family you can bore talking about the work you've been doing. I think it's just useful just to talk about things. So I think that's easy when you're doing something like looking at football, then you can talk to friends and family who you know are interested in the topic. But I just think, try and do research, find stories and share them with people. They'll probably appreciate hearing interesting things from you. But it's also a value, I think, in you just kind of sharing that and feeling that you can provide interesting stories to other people as well.
Yeah. Speaking of interesting stories, do you have any book, film, or album recommendations for us?
There's a particular album that I would recommend, actually, which is The Ballad of Johnny Longstaff by the Young Uns. They're a folk group from Shildon, and from Stockton, sorry. And they basically produced a folk album which tells the story of Johnny Longstaff, who was born in the 1920s in Stockton. And he just lived an incredible life. He took part in the hunger marches down to London in the 1930s, fought the black shirts at the Battle of Cable Street, and then ended up going to fight fascists again in the Spanish Civil War, and then returned back to Britain, had a conversation with Winston Churchill, and then signed up to fight in the Second World War. And so they've written a series of songs which tell the story of Johnny Longstaff. And it was actually, I saw it performed up in Edinburgh. It was the last thing I'd seen pre-lockdown and COVID. And I would highly recommend people to give it a listen, because it just tells an amazing story about an amazing figure of County Durham who's been forgotten but has been written back into history.
Just before we wrap up this episode, indulge my curiosity and hopefully the curiosity of the listeners. You talked about your dissertation during your undergraduate studies was on prisoner of war camps in the First World War and football. Tell us something about the role that football played in those prisoner of war camps.
Well, football played tons of roles within prisoner of war camps in the First World War, and I'd read a book which had briefly mentioned it and thought it seemed so bizarre that football could be played in such hostile environments. But football was really widely played, and the playing of football within prisoner of war camps helped to spread football globally, because you had British teams of English and Scottish and Irish soldiers who would play football and then teach groups of Russian soldiers and French soldiers who were also in prison. So allies would play each other. They had little tournaments. And actually, there's even some evidence that in some of the internment camps within Germany, they pioneered really interesting tactics as well. And some of those prisoners later moved to Spain and took some of these tactics with them. So there's some argument actually that tiki-taka style of football originates in prisoner of war camps in the First World War.
Wow. Who knew that was the origins of Barcelona and Cruyff and Guardiola, and that style of football was actually born in the prisoner of war camps. Well, Jake, it's been an absolute pleasure to speak to you. It's been very informative and very interesting, and it's great to hear your passion for the study of history and also your passion for parts of history that have not yet been probably uncovered for a mainstream audience, which I think that's the part of pursuing history that makes it so exciting. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks. All the best.
I think what really strikes me after talking to Jake is how rich and varied the experiences that he has had so far in his very young life, and the contacts that he has been able to establish through his work with the Holocaust Educational Trust, his work with Arsenal Football Club, now working on the research project for Everton, mean that he is going to be able to do lots and lots of interesting work in the future. And I certainly look forward to reading the fruits of his labour and his research in the next few years. If you have an interesting story or know someone who you think would be well suited to be featured on the Made in Teasdale podcast, then please get in touch and let me know. Until the next episode, stay safe, take care, and goodbye.